With the Switch 2, we are entering a new era for Nintendo, and in this video we're going to be focusing particularly on what this amazing new console augurs for the Legend of Zelda series. We'll study the development teams and in some cases the specific people who have been working on the Zelda teams and consider what kind of timelines we might expect for their Switch 2 work. Also crucial for Zelda is the way that this franchise can be expanded and developed, and we'll look at specific individuals who might be crucial to this endeavour and the kinds of ways that Zelda could grow in the next 8 to 10 years. We'll look at how soon the next mainline Zelda may or may not be, and explore how Nintendo may solve the problem of ever longer development times for its mainline Zelda games. Let's recap though what we know coming off the Switch generation. Zelda has always been a major franchise for Nintendo, but with Zelda Breath of the Wild passing 30 million in sales to become the fourth best-selling game on a system with some staggeringly high sellers already, the franchise is truly on the map. 2027 will see the first live-action film, and if all goes to plan, 2030 and 2033, both dates still conceivably within the Switch 2 era, will also see sequels. We've got the 40th anniversary of the franchise in 2026, and the Nintendo Today app not only has a Zelda theme but is promoting a lot of Zelda content. And Nintendo has broadly managed to bring Zelda to being an annual franchise with 8 games in the first 8 years of the original Nintendo Switch. As yet, though, there are some things that Nintendo does not have. The franchise does not have any significant theme park representation, unlike Mario and Donkey Kong. It also continues to struggle with timeframes for its major games. Eiji Aonuma commented in 2013, "I think before we did maybe try to make Zelda games come out faster, but there's so much expected of Zelda titles now, so you have to reach a certain level of quality, so that's why we started to take a bit more time now. I don't think it's necessary that development needs to be longer, but to reach a certain level of quality, there's just a certain amount of time that's needed. Obviously, the company is telling me that I need to put out games as quickly as possible." End quote. So let's start by looking at how this conundrum has been solved so far on the Nintendo Switch by deep diving the current Zelda development operation. Currently, there are 5 major groups who have been involved with Zelda over the recent period. Firstly, we have the core team under the leadership of Hidemaro Fujibayashi. Then we have AAA Games team dedicated to the Hyrule Warriors spin-offs. We have the top-down titles under the leadership of Grezo. Then there are remakes with Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword HD, most recently shepherded out of Australia by Tantalus. And then there was the seemingly one-off partnership brokered by Spike Chunsoft of Nintendo's Zelda property with Crypt of the Necrodancer developers Brace Yourself Games to create Cadence of Hyrule. Obviously, the main Zelda group are going to be the most interesting part of the equation going forward, but I think there are quite a few potential complications to discuss with regard to how that team progresses. So let's stick a pin in that discussion for now and look at the other groups in consideration. Any of these groups are possible or indeed potentially likely to return for further Zelda action games in the fullness of time, with the possible exception of the Crypt of the Necrodancer group Brace Yourself Games. The first game seemed to be reasonably successful, but Brace Yourself Games has had layoffs recently, and besides, I'm not sure what else there is to do with rhythm-based Hyrule, as fun as it was the first time. I do hope it showed Nintendo how gorgeous the Minish Cap art style could be if used in a modern context, but if there is to be further Nintendo necrodancing mashing up, I wouldn't necessarily expect Link and Zelda to feature, and it's quite possible that we could see a different Nintendo franchise plugged in. As for the already announced upcoming title, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, the studio now called AAA seems to be responsible. We'll see in the credits how they relate to the old Amiga Force, but Koei Tecmo has always managed a huge number of these Warriors titles with often not a lot of overlap between the dev staff, and I'm sure they have the strength in depth at that company to keep pushing out Hyrule Warriors titles, given that they are broadly well received. the trend of the second and third games is to tie into the previous mainline titles, but even if the next mainline Zelda title isn't ready to have a sequel by 2030 or 2031, where on current timeframes the next Hyrule Warrior will be due, I would still expect another Hyrule Warriors before the system's life is over, and we'll cycle back later to what that could be and why. Alongside the Hyrule Warriors team, we have Grezo, who now seem to be well ensconced as the developers of the 2D top-down series. Link's Awakening took about 4 years to develop as far as we can tell, and Echoes of Wisdom 5, so this would put the next 2D Zelda at 2028 or 2029. But the question is, what kind of game will Grezo develop? Link's Awakening was only chosen as a choice of remake as a way to host the Dunpei's Dungeon side game, and that Dungeon Maker concept gave birth to what eventually became Echoes of Wisdom. Therefore, I would suggest that there are 3 main routes that they could go. First, another original Zelda in the style of Echoes of Wisdom, possibly continuing to put Zelda herself in the lead as a way to distinguish the title from the core games. Secondly, they could try to do something in the maker space still. While there's clearly an interest from the team, they evidently moved away from this in the development of Echoes of Wisdom towards a more traditional type of game, and in many respects that's unsurprising. A Zelda maker would be hard to put off in a way that makes sense for satisfying dungeons to be readily designed, and I think the series lends itself far less well to a maker title than something like Mario. Still, with mouse mode and the enduring popularity of Zelda, it's not impossible that Nintendo could eventually crack it. Alternatively, they could go for a remake of a past title. There are a lot of titles that could potentially be redone, with A Link to the Past perhaps being the most profitable potential remake given its strong reputation. However, the one that might benefit the most is the second Zelda game, Adventure of Link. It seems likely that they will give the aesthetics an overhaul, since every handheld generation has tried a new look for Zelda games, and in this case it may make more sense to do what they did with Link's Awakening and start with a pre-existing title before then progressing to use that same engine and that same graphical look for an original game. Then we have the Australian team Tantalus, whose Twilight Princess team waited 5 years before delivering Skyward Sword. They also had a team working on Luigi's Mansion 2, although, as I've covered previously, this seems to be quite a different group of people, whereas the Twilight Princess team largely carried over to Skyward Sword HD, suggesting a consistent group of people working on Zelda content. Aonuma commented that, "I felt they had strong developing skills from seeing their work across remakes of previous titles, and he has worked closely with them for quite a long time now, so it would be reasonable to expect that they would continue this nearly decade-long relationship." I think, therefore, the question isn't whether Tantalus will have a new Zelda game, but when they'll have a new Zelda game, and if they're following a similar kind of time frame as the last 2 titles, this would mean delivery circa 2026. Although a small core team in Kyoto has supervised these games in the past, they have been largely left to their own devices, albeit with some senior figures at the helm. Twilight Princess HD was directed by Eiji Aonuma himself, while Daiki Iwamoto led Skyward Sword HD. The thing is, though, if we're looking at a remaster on this scale, the boat has probably left the harbour. The next logical Zelda remasters would have been either Breath of the Wild, continuing the trend of giving Zelda a second run out about a decade after their first outing, or Wind Waker in presumably a 4K form this time. The switch to April Direct firmly put both of those out of contention because versions of the originals are available in 2025. Although I have seen some speculation that Wind Waker HD could still make the Switch 2 in some form, I really think that this is pie-in-the-sky stuff. Nintendo held back Super Mario RPG from the SNES app on Nintendo Switch Online when they were remaking that game, and Link's Awakening, whose glorious original game feels incredibly dated next to its lavish remake, only made the system in 2024. Personally, I expect we will see Wind Waker HD maybe a decade or so hence when Nintendo Classics gets a Wii U app, but not before. It also kinda puts pay to any significant reprisal of the Toon Link aesthetic. With Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, this look had its day in the sun, and I could have seen a case, once upon a time, for putting a refreshed Wind Waker alongside a remake of one or both of these games as a way to revive that Wind Waker look that was, for a period of time, quite successful. However, with the film being live action, and with even the original Wind Waker receiving a sufficiently negative reaction that Twilight Princess's very different aesthetic received whoops of joy at E3, I think they are more cautious about where and how to deploy this version of Link. It's not impossible that they could return to it, of course, but my sense is that just like Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom tried something new with the toy capsule look, they will probably want to move on to a new art style rather than calling back. What about Twilight Princess? Interviewed on the Fantastic Kiwi Talks podcast, Tantalus environmental artist Emily McGregor mentioned the frustration in that game that they were assigned to update the textures, but some of the main models could have been updated further. Is there unfinished business for this Wii classic? Twilight Princess makes perhaps a more natural complement to a live-action film with its more sinister aesthetic, so it could yet receive a different treatment from Wind Waker, but with the Wii being a near inevitability for the Nintendo Classics line this generation, it seems like Nintendo may simply repeat their trick with Wind Waker and use a slightly enhanced version of the original game as a selling point for the system. This leaves on the table the game I think they're most likely to be working on, a game which would definitely require far more than just a revision of textures, 1998's Ocarina of Time. And while there are many routes an Ocarina of Time remake could go, from just tidying up the version Grezo did for 3DS to some kind of Final Fantasy VII remake style overhaul, I would anticipate something more in the vein of the Switch Link's Awakening. Broadly very faithful, but a comprehensive graphical departure. Obviously, there are a great many examples of what this could look like from fan projects, but knowing Nintendo, I wouldn't be surprised if they use this as a way to try a quite distinctive art style. Whichever way they go, though, a new Ocarina of Time would be a substantially bigger project than the Tantalus team has handled before, because the games wouldn't just need remastering, but a flat-out remake in many respects, and the previous Ocarina of Time 3D remake in 2011 was handheld and maintained by Grezo. But the Zelda team's two-game relationship with Tantalus suggests that they have some trust in the team, and in the past, where this trust relationship has blossomed, we've also eventually seen it deepened. Look at how Grezo also progressed from being primarily a port studio for the Zelda team to being the lead developers of their very own 2D Zelda line. It seems locked on that there will be a Zelda remake this generation because, when aren't there? And so a Tantalus Ocarina does seem likely to some degree, and we'll get into specifics of how likely later on. Also worth noting here, though, is the existence of the Monolith Soft Assist Studio. I suspect that this group will find other useful work until the next open-air Zelda is ready for full-on development. Who knows, the next 3D Mario may benefit from their world design talents. But if a new Ocarina was a far bigger project than Nintendo has given to Tantalus before, having Monolith Soft involved might be a real asset, and it would have been a next natural project for the developers after Tears of the Kingdom finished full production. Of all the Zelda teams, Tantalus seems likeliest to have a new Zelda announced soon, but could we see a Monolith Soft initiated Zelda? Quite a number of staff from Xenoblade Chronicles X progressed to work on Breath of the Wild, but many of the key figures did not return for subsequent Zelda titles, and it seems that at this point, it was very much a side job for them. There are certainly people who have progressed at Monolith Soft since working on Breath of the Wild, such as Imi Takano, who has gone from the cutscene lead on Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition to becoming the event director for Xenoblade Chronicles 3. If Nintendo wanted to make cinematics more of a focus in a future title, they might look at poaching someone like Takano, but mostly Monolith Soft crossovers were focused on art, and while people from the art department have definitely ended up in very senior positions across the company before, 3D Mario's Yoshihiko Koizumi, Kenta Motokura, and indeed Shigeru Miyamoto being just three examples of top talent at Nintendo who started out as artists, there's not any individual who seems primed to step forward, and it's quite difficult to fully identify Monolith Soft staff, as many of the EPD support group have only worked on Nintendo games such as Splatoon 2, Breath of the Wild, and Animal Crossing, so that when you deep dive the credits, it's actually quite hard to disaggregate who is part of Monolith Soft and who is just part of the core Nintendo studios. However, Monolith Soft advertised for a large expansion around 2021, with many of these people seemingly going to the Zelda team. It would be surprising if among these weren't people who might one day take the lead of Zelda, and Zelda fans should be well aware of how flagship games Hidemaro Fujibayashi went from the director of the Capcom Zeldas to being the leading light on Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. However, there are other options for the Monolith Soft team, which we'll return to in due course. It will soon be time to talk about the most difficult and complicated problem of all, how the main team will break down, but Nintendo is putting a lot behind Zelda, and it makes sense that they will not only want to rely on the current conga line of remakes, 2D titles, and Warriors games, punctuated by the occasional mainline masterpiece, but additionally look to use Zelda in new contexts. In particular, though this is something I address in a separate video more fully, Zelda represents their best franchise for targeting teens and above. If Kirby and Yoshi are the franchises for tiny children and Mario and Friends are games for the whole family, then Zelda is the more adult-skewed fare that people will fall in love with as they start to approach their teenage years. The Mario Party series suits Mario because it brings together the family and friendship groups for casual fun, but even if they could do this with Zelda, why would they? They'd just be cannibalizing their own audience. What they need is to find a lucrative new market that Zelda as a franchise can help them approach, a niche specific to Zelda. Well, one long-held ambition of the Zelda team has always been to make the games more physically immersive, not just clicking buttons, but swinging arms to strike with a sword and using gyro controls to take careful aim with an arrow. Skyward Sword has until now been the apotheosis of this type of Zelda game, and while that title didn't meet with the acclaim they clearly wanted, I don't know that Nintendo is done with the concept just yet. More commonly, these concepts seem to percolate at the company until they find new expression, and I think a fitness-centered Zelda game does make a world of sense to me. With the Nintendo Switch 2 camera, your running and sword swinging and bow pulling and shield wielding could be translated more or less one-to-one into the game, especially if there were clear props that were sold with the title. Sell a sword and a shield for the Joy-Con to clip into, and they could make the dream come alive of truly being Link exploring the wilds of Hyrule. I don't think I need to do much to persuade you that Nintendo would be interested in such an idea. It's basically the dream of Skyward Sword all over again, except writ large. But with the group being so busy, who could develop such a title? It's not like there's some developer with vast experience of the technical aspects of motion control gaming, a deep knowledge of Zelda, and an experience with fitness titles who in recent years has suddenly seemed to be stunningly underemployed for a man of his talents. I mean, that couldn't happen, could it? If you think I don't have anyone in mind, you probably haven't been paying attention, so let's take a moment to talk about Kenji Matsutani. Like many EPD mainstays, Kenji Matsutani is a stalwart of the Nintendo scene, with credits stretching back to 1997's Star Fox 64, and he's worked on the technical team for every main console Zelda since Ocarina of Time. Notably though, he was one of two technical leads on Skyward Sword, but he also, in the interim, was a programmer on Wii Fit. Clearly then, this is a gentleman with some pertinent experience, but have his recent credits shown that he's absolutely indispensable to the core team? Well, in Tears of the Kingdom, he worked in enemy programming. Important, sure, but as prestigious as the technical lead? Not really. But hey, if he's leading the department, that would track. Well, I'm sure you've anticipated by now that he wasn't. In fact, in a credit system that appears to list people broadly in seniority order, this 30-year Nintendo veteran who helped build the immortal Ocarina of Time was listed 25th in the credits, which means one of two things to me. Either, and who could blame him, he's max chillaxing while he counts down the days before he cashes in his pension and heads into the sunset for a life of Mai Tais on his Okinawa beach house. That, frankly, is the likelier option. However, another plausible reading of this career trajectory is that his Tears of the Kingdom work was really very much a side project, a case of a seasoned veteran lending the bright young things a bit of programming muscle while working on something bigger and separate for the company. And if that's the case, prototyping a fitness-based Zelda drawing on his experience of both Wii Fit and the Skyward Sword control scheme could be the kind of career highlight a gentleman whose career has already been exceptional would rather enjoy. Switch 2 director and Tears of the Kingdom's technical lead Takahiro Dota also worked on Ring Fit Adventure, so the links between the fitness team and the Zelda team are still well developed, and since Dota's Switch 2 work included the camera system, one imagines that he could have had aspirations for its use in a series he spent practically his whole career working on. So yes, I think a fitness-centric Zelda spin-off is not just possible, but ultimately quite likely, especially during that period around or immediately after the launch of the Zelda film. I should note here as well the way that Shuntaro Furukawa is constantly talking about using various initiatives to bring the company's objectives back to their core IP. Something like Ring Fit, which didn't use the core Nintendo IP, did quite well, but it seems now going forward that they really want to bring people round to their Nintendo characters, and so putting Zelda as the face of a game like this could be the kind of step that they're now ready for. Now, why do I link this to the coming of the Zelda film? Well, look, maybe the film's a hit and they need a big game anyway, and maybe it's a failure, in which case it will still bring attention to the Zelda franchise, and hopefully people will simply assume, as with the 90s Super Mario Bros. Movie, that it was a misguided attempt at bringing to life great source material rather than reflecting negatively on Zelda itself. But come what may, an audience significantly made up of younger and more largely male viewers who like epic fantasy cinema will be scrutinizing the franchise, and a fitness title in this context makes sense for the audience. Although more likely to appeal to men than I suggest Ring Fit was probably designed to do, it's a franchise with an inbuilt choice of strong male and female protagonists. Nobody can complain about a choice of Link and Zelda, and with Game Chat it's quite possible that you could play games with both characters running around the Hylian fields. According to 2025 figures, 56% of Japanese households have more than one television, and in any event, the Switch 2 has a kickstand, meaning that potentially two people in the same household could play two-player in different rooms with a Switch 2. No second game, no problem. GameShare has you covered. Mid-generation, Nintendo will need reasons for people to buy multiple Switch 2s, and this could be one of those reasons. If not fitness games though, where else could Zelda go? Cadence of Hyrule isn't the first time that the focus has been given to the series' musical majesty, with Zelda concerts not just being a treat for the anniversary, but being showcased in the early days of the Nintendo Today app. How many series have their most iconic game named after a woodwind instrument, after all? We've seen Nintendo try a music-based game as far back as 2008's Wii Music, but the game didn't exactly light the world on fire. However, with a microphone and a camera and rumble, the potential of a music title which gamifies the process of creating beautiful sounds in a Zelda environment could become a lot more appealing. What's more, with Game Chat, the potential exists to link together with others and create some kind of orchestra. This was literally a subplot in Tears of the Kingdom, so we know that the idea has occurred to them. I'm not saying an orchestra game is flat out likely, but it seems like one form that a musical Zelda game could take, and I do think Nintendo's long-standing interest in music games would find a better partner with Zelda as an IP than pretty much anything else. Then again, one option they've already tried is an arrow shooting game alongside the lines of Link's crossbow training. That title was a glorified tech demo summoned into being by Miyamoto and utilizing Twilight Princess assets, but in theory, the broadly adult male audience of the Zelda movie may like a more adrenaline-fueled arrow shooting title. However, while it makes sense from an audience point of view, it strikes me that, while this could be a great aspect in a broader physical Zelda title, it's unlikely to really have enough content for a modern game these days. We should also bear in mind the way these projects are devised. Sometimes it's from a senior producer identifying a type of game that they would like to make. But Cadence of Hyrule and Twilight Princess HD seem to come about from external pitches, though in the case of Twilight Princess HD, they were probably invited to pitch given the relative success of Wind Waker HD. there are also so many people with a passion for Zelda that chances have to be high that at least one person will spark something of interest at Nintendo. And if one of these projects does mesh with their ambitions for the franchise, we could see something, even if currently they don't have a particular plan in mind as to how to utilize Zelda in these kinds of ways. Okay then, let's stop beating around the bush. We've discussed Grezo and the Warriors team, we've discussed new concepts and even some specific developers, but the true light of Hylian genius is carried by the core Zelda team, which in recent years has been under the leadership of Hidemaro Fujibayashi, reporting of course to Eiji Aonuma, who has for decades been the face of Zelda development. However, the Switch 2 era is likely to see some major changes to many of these long-standing teams, and I think we need to think very carefully about what the core Zelda team will be doing this generation. From day one, they have likely been responsible for the Nintendo Switch 2 edition versions of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and doubtless EPD3 will at least have overseen the development of Zelda Notes. All that lore had to come from somewhere, though I doubt it taxed the game development group too much, especially given what an afterthought the story seems to be for Fujibayashi at least. How long then until the next mainline Zelda comes to visit? This is always the eternal question we have to ask ourselves, and while it's important to be sure, as a rule, I've always found that what works pretty well when estimating Nintendo is to take the absolute longest you think is plausible for something to happen, and then just add a little bit longer on top. Basically, I would expect to be waiting a fair time. Since Ocarina of Time, every console Zelda has taken progressively longer and longer, and so I think we're probably talking 2028 at the earliest, but the fact is we always tend to underestimate the development times on these games. Few, if any, people really thought that the next Zelda game would be later than 2021 or 2022, and the idea that the Nintendo Switch itself would last 8 years, let alone more than 8 years, was once a very fringe notion. I hate to speak this into existence, but it's quite possible that, like Mario Kart, like other AAA titles across the industry, we could have an 8 or 10-year development cycle for the next Zelda, which would put us into 2032 or 2033 and the likely successor to the Nintendo Switch 2 before we actually get to a new Zelda. We have precedent for this, in fact. Skyward Sword arrived late on Wii, and the Wii U Zelda was therefore delayed and delayed and delayed until the dawn of the final day. Switch 2 will hopefully have a far longer life than Wii U, but then again, the next Zelda may also need a far longer development time, so the chances of it potentially being pushed to a new system are that much higher. If this is the case, though, one thing I feel certain about is that Nintendo will need to have a plan B. This series is far too big to skip a generation without it being a running sore for Nintendo, especially when the franchise has the chance at a bigger breakthrough still thanks to the movie. A massive-scale Ocarina remake would be a big feather in the Switch 2's cap, but even then I think it would be very difficult for Nintendo to labour for the whole Switch 2 generation under the cloud of not having had an original mainline 3D Zelda. Therefore, I think we should consider some different options for what should come next, and there is a solution we've seen several times before. We should consider the possibility of the Zelda team splitting into two. With development times ever lengthening, having a second team working on Zelda might be a very savvy investment for Nintendo, and there is precedent elsewhere in Nintendo's orbit. The 3D Mario team seems to have managed to produce titles alongside its main fare, such as Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, for a while now, and Game Freak especially have two concurrent Pokemon teams. Ocarina of Time could be a great project to get a new team at Nintendo on their feet, and as Nintendo often like their developers to remake titles as an orientation exercise before doing something new, it could be that they have greater ambitions for this team than just the single title. We've already had our numerous oblique hints about people not knowing the origin of Raru when discussing Tears of the Kingdom, which match the same kind of light teasing he did when he talked in 2016 about wanting to do a game where you played as a thief, while Link's Awakening's remake was ramping up, a game where you can, if you so wish, embark on a life of crime at the risk of people calling you a thief for the rest of the game. But if there is to be a developer split, how would the split likely take place? I think to understand this, we need to talk a little about the internal dynamics of the senior Zelda team. In a separate video, I explored the 2D Zelda group, which essentially scattered to the wind after A Link Between Worlds. Now, Grezo with Tomomi Sano from EPD are leading development on that front, and it's likely to be a team which can continue for some time into the future. But the 3D team is mostly centralized around the figure of Hidemaro Fujibayashi, who directed, as I say, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom, and who has already talked about his ideas for the next Zelda, or at least that he has them, although he hadn't at that time discussed them with Eiji Aonuma. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been other groups capable and interested in taking on projects. We're going to need to go back in time to 2017 when the Champions Ballad DLC was released. It's not uncommon for the director of a DLC to be different from the director of the main game. Mario Kart 8, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass each had different directors after all. And Breath of the Wild head honcho, Hidemaro Fujibayashi, was still credited as a supervisor on the project. We also know that Tears of the Kingdom itself started out as DLC ideas, and so when they said that they'd started work on the game that became Tears of the Kingdom after the completion of the Champions Ballad, it made a lot of sense if they originally had intended to do a further Breath of the Wild expansion, since it was essentially a continuation of their original project. Think back to how barren 2018 and the first half of 2019 were for Nintendo on the Switch in terms of new games. They knew at this point they would need time to reorientate their 3DS and Wii U teams to train all fire on developing for Switch, and they had already front-loaded a lot of their core development capital on making 2017's lineup incredibly robust. There was also a reference at the time of Breath of the Wild by Eiji Aonuma that he expected all future Zelda titles to have DLC. I can well imagine that they had once intended a major new Breath of the Wild DLC to launch in maybe late 2018 or the first quarter of 2019, and that once they decided to expand this project beyond simply a DLC pack, they figured they'd burn off some of the existing concept work for the E3 teaser in 2019, knowing that they would likely redo everything for the larger scale project anyway. This also is what makes me lean towards them not doing another super early teaser for the next game, but that's by the by. For now, let's just zone in on that period. If this theory is correct, what else follows from it? We know that the Champions Ballad director Kentaro Tominaga left around this time. He was poached by Chinese developer Paper Games to develop what became Infinity Nikki. At the time, Chinese developers were pouring money into poaching Japanese game talent. Logically, Tominaga was the heir apparent at the Zelda development team until this point, and if he had led the previous Zelda DLC, it might have made sense for him to move on to working on the more expansive second string DLC after working on the first one. This would have freed up Hidemaro Fujibayashi to continue his supervisory role while planning for the next game, plans which likely were already going down the path of the fuse and Ultra Hand mechanics that made Tears of the Kingdom so distinctive. That means that already in 2018 there could have been both a main Zelda group and a significant branch team. Tominaga's Breath of the Wild DLC group would be given the Switch's legendary launch title one last major push, making it a true evergreen title for the Switch generation, while Fujibayashi's team concerned themselves with the next generation of the series, likely targeting the Switch successor. But once the decision was made that Tears of the Kingdom had outgrown simply a DLC, Tominaga would effectively have lost his directorship role to Fujibayashi. The game didn't need two directors. I'm not suggesting this was acrimonious or anything, but Nintendo generally does a very good job of retaining its staff, and yet, seen in this context, it would make sense why, at this stage, Tominaga might feel that he would prefer to take an opportunity, when Paper Games presented it to him, to head his own project outside Nintendo, rather than continue in essentially the same kind of more junior position he had been in for some years. Tominaga receives a special thanks credit on Tears of the Kingdom, but nothing more, suggesting that he must have left pretty early in development, but working on what essentially became a prototype for the game before the tea table was upturned, might explain the nature of what he's being thanked for. Of course, all of this is I completely concede, highly speculative, but it would make sense of some of Nintendo's decisions over the last few years. And from this decision, the whole plan for the future of the Zelda series would have been put out of whack. I'm sure that in an ideal world, Nintendo would have wanted to repeat that incredible success of the 1-2 punch beginning of the Switch's lifespan. You have an epic new Zelda game, followed by a huge Mario Kart. They're delivering the huge Mario Kart with Mario Kart World, but Switch 2 is noticeably short of a new Zelda at launch. Of course, without a Breath of the Wild expansion pack, and with expectations so incredibly high for the future of the series after Breath of the Wild, there is no way Tears of the Kingdom could realistically have been pushed to the next system when it was an obvious sequel game and reused the same world. But this means that as a result, there would have been no launch day Zelda for Switch 2. Let's cycle forward to 2023. While DLC was always expected for future Zelda games, the decision was clearly made to wrap up very quickly on Tears of the Kingdom. I always thought and frankly hoped that it would be possible that there would be a big expansion for Switch 2 in the manner of what we now know are the Nintendo Switch 2 editions. Logically, just like Super Mario Party Jamboree got a plus game revision, a plus game for Tears of the Kingdom would have been a great way to give some attention to the Zelda franchise at the top of the new system's life, but they opted not to do so. Possibly they thought that the market wouldn't support it. $80 Mario Kart World is one thing, but if they added $20 or $30 worth of DLC on top of Tears of the Kingdom, a game already costing $70, you'd be talking about a title potentially selling for a recommended retail price of $100. But more than that, this would have required a branch team, and my theory is that the branch team already existed and were already working on something new. Fujibayashi alluded in the 2023 interviews to Tears of the Kingdom to the fact that he had an idea for the next Zelda, but he had yet to run it by Aonuma. This struck me as odd, given the amount of time Tears of the Kingdom had spent being polished, reportedly a year or more. Surely the Picard and Riker of the Zelda development universe would at least have talked about what might have come next. But they wouldn't have needed to if they already knew what came next, and what came next did not involve Fujibayashi. Kentaro Tominaga might have been gone, but just as he had been the top credited and it would appear the most senior designer on Breath of the Wild before he took on the DLC, so Yohei Fujino appears to have been the most senior figure on both the Champion's Ballad and the game design team of Tears of the Kingdom. Granted, he's not the only senior figure that might take on such an expanded role. Tears of the Kingdom assistant director Yuya Sato might also be due such a promotion. Either way, it seems quite plausible to me that Nintendo may have wanted to avoid a repeat of the Tominaga situation, assuming that's what happened, and give their top talent a chance to do a bigger title. This might not necessarily have meant another Zelda game. Shiramori left the 2D Zelda team to take the helm on Super Mario Bros. Wonder, for example, and in the case of the technical director of the recent Zeldas, Takehiro Dota, he was obviously given a very different kind of promotion, becoming the director of Nintendo Switch 2. Still, I'm sure they want to keep some of their top people within the Zelda group, and it would be logical given the importance of the Zelda franchise to the company if they did have a Zelda sequel in the works a little bit earlier. Okay, so far, so flimsy. These game designers may be serious rising stars, but Nintendo usually requires one of their absolute long-time greybeards to be involved in a project. Hayashida, in the case of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, was brought over from the 3D Mario team to support Shiramori, and of course, both of them worked under Miyamoto's number 2 on the original Super Mario Bros. Title, the inimitable Takashi Tezuka. Surely all these figures that we've discussed would have been focused on Tears of the Kingdom while they were working on that title. Well, maybe not. Now we need to talk about a figure I mentioned in passing at the start of the video, but who we now need to consider in far greater depth. Daiki Iwamoto. Iwamoto's history with the Zelda franchise is about as deep as Eiji Aonuma's. He was the cinema scene unit assist director on Ocarina of Time, and by 2007 he had taken over as the director of many of the games, leading both Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks for the DS before returning to the console games to lead Wind Waker HD on Wii U. By a link between worlds, he had moved on to a more supervisory position, but still kept his hand in more direct development work, serving as the supervisor for the game design on the Breath of the Wild expansion pass and the director of 2021's Skyward Sword HD. Apart from that, he has most commonly been identified by a credit which appears to denote that he worked with the Zelda team but only helps out while ploughing his own furrow. Tears of the Kingdom, assistant producer. Echoes of Wisdom, assistant producer. Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, there he was a supervisor, but since he double-duted this with working on Skyward Sword, it seems that the man has a lot more to offer, and his recent credits certainly leave open the likelihood that he is currently working on a significant Zelda release a lot more closely than on the other titles. But all of this is still very messy. Iwamoto's history wouldn't suggest a whole new game, but rather leading something like Ocarina. After all, he led the port Wind Waker HD and Skyward Sword HD, and he himself worked on Ocarina of Time. I still think Iwamoto is the most likely choice for this side project. What more perfect example of bringing things full circle could there be? Well, maybe there's one other person more suited to leading an Ocarina remake, and that would be Eiji Aonuma. Now, I'm not suggesting that Aonuma take the director's chair again himself, but the man is clearly still waist deep in Zelda even now, even writing the story for Echoes of Wisdom himself. If he were to take a much stronger personal hand in an Ocarina of Time remake, it would render Iwamoto's involvement less necessary and in fact would allow a more managerial figure to take the day-to-day helm, much as Tomomi Sano came over from the project coordination department for Echoes of Wisdom. Or, of course, there are the senior figures we've already discussed from the Tears of the Kingdom staff who might step up. This, in turn, would allow Aonuma to start to delegate some of his more senior responsibilities to someone who potentially could take over from him as the lead producer of Zelda over the medium term. Now, if we take the assumption that Iwamoto is not the person leading a potential Ocarina remake, he could well have his own team separate from Fujibashi's, still working on an original 3D game. I doubt he'll be the director again, but there are plenty of people from the current team who could work on that project with the wisdom and input of the senior producer. This means that the Ocarina developers wouldn't become the branch developers, they would be the core Tears of the Kingdom staff. Even, there's an outside chance, Fujibayashi himself. Why, though, would Fujibayashi be attached to an Ocarina of Time game, a game he never worked on and that is so unlike the style of games he has come to be developing, especially after he had already said that he had ideas for his own next game? I think it's unlikely he himself would be on this title, but recall once more how Wind Waker HD was used to orientate the development staff around the requirements of a more open game. What if Ocarina of Time were to be used by Nintendo in a similar way? Nintendo, and particularly the Zelda team, do respond quite a lot to fan feedback, and they occasionally make quite abrupt about turns in response. The lack of openness in Skyward Sword was criticised, and the team took a radically different direction, while the criticism of the homogeneity of the dungeons of Breath of the Wild led to the more aesthetically diverse Tears of the Kingdom temples, even if their structure still didn't quite satisfy many of the audience. One major area of development for the next game may be the story and the storytelling. One only has to glance at Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza to see how gloriously expressive and emotive these characters are. Link is capable of looking shocked and surprised, I grant you, but the character designs in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are still too wooden to make true acting a possibility. Therefore, if the core team really wanted expressive character performance and narrative to be a core element of the next Zelda title, it may well require them to spend some time under the bonnet of Ocarina of Time figuring out how acting could work on that game, a game with a story so beloved and iconic that in many people's eyes it remains the gold standard for the franchise all these years later. Irrespective of where Fujibayashi himself falls in this reconfiguration, here is how I imagine the Zelda split would work. You would have Fujibayashi with a small group still trying to stand on its feet a new set of mechanics for an open-air Zelda. Meanwhile, a good chunk of the core development staff would stay with Ocarina of Time, possibly coordinating with Tantalus and or Monolith Soft, likely, though not necessarily, under the direction of Iwamoto. In this case, the collaboration with the outside groups would resemble something closer to what we see with Pikmin 4, where 18 were a significant support group, but not the lead developers, even though they had developed Pikmin 3 Deluxe under their own steam. However, all this would happen where there's a significant group, perhaps led by Iwamoto, perhaps by Fujino or Sato, who would have branched off all the way back in around 2022. While Tears of the Kingdom was moving to that long review phase, which reportedly involved the whole staff, perhaps just one or two people could have started musing on working on a different project, another Zelda title. By the time Fujibayashi was musing about his next Zelda, he knew that there was no great priority because there could have been another group handling a Switch 2 project. Now, this could still have been the Ocarina of Time development, but it could have been another project as well. This would have allowed Fujibayashi a much more luxurious period of reflection, safe in the knowledge that his next true game would actually be slated for the 2030s. Now, some of the key team could have moved on to supporting Ocarina of Time, allowing Fujibayashi to help the new kids on the block with their own Zelda projects while planning his own. Now, this does seem quite extreme to have not just two Zelda teams, but three, but if they are looking in the very long term, and given the amount of talent that they have, and given that they can liberally use support studios such as Tantalus, it does seem possible that they could have expanded their reach significantly. While I mused earlier about the emergence of Monolith Soft as a team, I suspect an EPD3 branch team with Monolith Soft supporting may be more likely, and for precedent we can look to EPD5. That team juggles Splatoon and Animal Crossing, and while over the course of the Switch's life their credits seem to show progressively less overlap, it's still mainly in the art, music and technical departments that staff are shared, while the core game staff remain separate. If a secondary Zelda team emerged, a secondary mainline Zelda team I should say, it would make sense if the Monolith Soft team bounced between the two depending on which title was deeper into production. All that said, there's likely no shortage of Nintendo properties which could use the Monolith Soft team's tender attentions, but clearly the Zelda and Monolith Soft groups have a great partnership going, and this would be one way to deepen it. So if there were a separate Fujino-led team, such a game could potentially have already been in development starting in 2022 or 2023, targeting a release sometime towards the early middle of the Switch's life. Potentially, and to set expectations that this is not the only Zelda project on the cards from Nintendo in the coming decade, this could have quite a different focus, a spin-off in the style of Splatoon Raiders in the Zelda context. Now, an obvious one here would be a multiplayer Zelda. Takahiro Dota was the technical lead on the recent Zelda games and also the director of Switch 2. He has been very involved in game chat, and so a Zelda game that utilized game chat as a core feature, with friendship groups potentially collaborating as they explore the world of Hyrule, well, that could be a challenging new project for an upstart team, and one that Dota will be perfectly placed to support given his extensive experience for both Zelda and Switch 2. It's possible that we could see the fruits of such a team's labour quite soon if Nintendo pull a Bowser's Fury and have a plus game on Ocarina of Time. Now, there is precedent with Zelda doing this, even with a major title like Ocarina of Time. Remember A Link to the Past plus Four Swords on Game Boy Advance, or even the way Link's Awakening had a dungeon designer clamped onto it. But I'm not sure I see it here. As much as I personally adore Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time is in a different class of fame and public regard. But because it's been so long since the N64, we'd be looking at not an Ocarina of Time 3D kind of remake, but something far more expansive and ambitious. The idea that they clamp a side game onto it doesn't really merit too much consideration for me, but if they wanted to make this really stand out as a major new item in its own right, the possibility must be considered. But even as the world of Breath of the Wild was utilised as the backdrop for Tears in the Kingdom, just as the graphical style and possibility of the game engine and core programming structure of Link's Awakening was reused for Echoes of Wisdom, what if they planned to take the chassis of Ocarina of Time and build it into a multiplayer Zelda? This wouldn't presumably require a full 8-year development window, and potentially a lot of the work could actually be done in parallel with the base game. This would give us an original Zelda game, the first multiplayer game since 2015, in around 2029 or 2030, assuming that Ocarina of Time drops in 2026 or 2027. If they try to branch out more fully from the land of Ocarina of Time, we could be looking at 2031 or 2032 for a more substantial full-on single-player Zelda game, which happens to also have a multiplayer mechanic. Let's say Ocarina of Time cranks into production in 2022, after Iwamoto wrapped Skyward Sword and peeling off even more of the Tears of the Kingdom staff as work on that game started to scale down and neared an endpoint. By 2026 or 2027, we can expect that title to be finished and ready to be the banner Zelda game of the Switch 2's early life, especially if they drew heavily on Tantalus, Monolith Soft, and Grezo for development backup. 5 years is a very long time to have something like this in the oven, and it could be a very substantial experience. But having developed their understanding of Zelda titles with Ocarina of Time as a template, why would they not go for something more in the vein of that title? The difficulty here is that Aonuma has been fairly clear that he doesn't see the Ocarina of Time style, more linear experience as the future for the Zelda series, and his recent Echoes of Wisdom interview suggested that the ability to choose your own solution was even the very essence of a Zelda game. Having said that, Echoes of Wisdom showed that you could have a game that had some elements of linearity within a broad, open structure, and it's not like Ocarina of Time is anywhere near as linear as Skyward Sword is. I suspect that if a new team oriented themselves around the broad style, but then added an open twist, much as Grezo did with the 1-2 punch of Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom, then this might be the most likely outcome. Plus, as I've discussed earlier, the key point of learning from Ocarina of Time may not be the dungeon design or structure, but rather to emulate the storytelling. Therefore, assuming there is a split in the core team, this gives us a couple of options. We could have Fujibayashi on Switch 2, and potentially a more drama-centric new game from a team that cut their teeth on Ocarina. Or we could have Fujibayashi doing a project likely, for want of a better name, Switch 3, while a group leverages Ocarina's assets for a spin-off title on Switch 2. I think of the two scenarios, having the Fujibayashi game come to Switch 2 still probably makes more sense to me. After all, if this game is a 2030 or 2031 title, a healthy 8-year development cycle for the new game, then this would lead the Ocarina developers to start planning a title for 2033 or 2034, the next console's launch game. This doesn't preclude Dota or others building a social aspect into a Fujibayashi game, but I suspect the multiplayer aspect will be better received as one element of a title that was clearly an heir to the legacy of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, rather than, as has often been the case with multiplayer Zelda before, something that seems ultimately peripheral to the Zelda canon even from birth. If Ocarina gives the team a real grounding on how to tell stories and convey emotion through character animation, this would surely leverage the power of a Switch 3 Zelda, but there would be other advantages as well. By the time this new console came around, Eiji Aonuma would likely be 70, and even if he's still at Nintendo, it's likely that, as with Miyamoto, he would no longer be managing Zelda day to day himself. If the Fujibayashi Switch 2 game is directed by someone other than Fujibayashi himself, then Fujibayashi could step into Aonuma's shoes as the producer of the franchise, with an heir apparent from his team to work on the next Zelda already in place. Even if Fujibayashi does direct the next Zelda himself, I'm sure he will have an eye on his successor, and that this group will be more than capable of carrying on the torch whilst free from the pressures of having to make a launch title for the Switch 2 successor. It also seems plausible that, with the chassis of Ocarina of Time, Tantalus and others could then make a Majora's Mask sequel too, giving for the decade ahead a fourth major Zelda project, aside from Ocarina of Time, the Fujibayashi game, and a branch team game. It's possible, of course, that other games could serve this purpose, Twilight Princess probably being the most likely, but surely Ocarina of Time is the likeliest template for a film series, and since it's the 3D era Zelda title that's been the longest without revisitation, even if the movie performs only passably, it will surely stir up interest in the original game. interest that would probably peter out if the only option available were to play the dated feeling N64 game on Nintendo Classics. So, let's get back to where we started and see the prospects for the next few years. The baseline likelihood is a Zelda game a year, and that has been the average of recent years, even if 2019 had two and 2022 none. With the Nintendo Switch 2 editions of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom holding the line for 2025, they don't necessarily need another Zelda game this year, and Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment could meet its winter timeframe by being placed in January or February of 2026. Therefore, I don't think there's any imminent big Zelda game likely, and while February 2026 is technically the 40th anniversary of the franchise, I expect if Nintendo do anything for the 40th, and I don't see why they wouldn't, they would tilt it towards 2027 to separate that anniversary out from the Mario and Pokemon anniversaries, which they're celebrating around the same time. This means 2027 would make the most sense for an Ocarina game, probably in March alongside the movie, but potentially in October to follow up on the hype from the movie going before it. Just as Link's Awakening launched the Switch Lite, Ocarina of Time might make a very effective day one game for a Switch 2 Lite, although it wouldn't necessarily be my first bet. The Mario movie actually avoided having too many new Mario games beforehand, so they could sell the legacy games before starting a major run of Mario games in the month after, with Super Mario RPG, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, Mario Luigi Brothership, and Super Mario Party Jamboree, all in the 18 months immediately after the film, to say nothing of the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass. With Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, the Grezo games, Nintendo have an awful lot of tried and tested Zelda content to hook in new fans already, so there's no real rush for them for a big Zelda title just because a movie is coming along. The fact that they've announced free graphical updates to Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom suggests that neither will receive Plus games anytime soon, and I can't imagine Skyward Sword getting one either, given that it's so out of kilter with the modern style of games. Therefore, Ocarina of Time for late 2027 seems actually pretty feasible, and since it's likely to be a year without a mainline Pokemon, this would make a strong game for the pre-Thanksgiving holiday slot. 2028 or 2029 could therefore be another Grezo developed Zelda, perhaps not an Adventure of Link remake if it's following a remade Ocarina of Time, and so I'd lean towards something original, albeit probably in a new 2D style. If the Zelda film does for the character of Zelda what the Mario film did for the character of Peach, and how could it not if they maintain Link's mute status and want to have her earn the status of being the title character, it feels likely that Nintendo will want another game with Zelda herself in the lead, and that's also harder to do with a remake. So, an original Grezo Zelda for 2028 or 2029 feels quite probable. Also in this time period, it might be a time for something more left field in the manner of Cadence of Hyrule, whether it's a Zelda music game or a fitness title allowing the newfound casual audience of moviegoers to augment their fitness regime with a bit of bokoblin bashing action. It would make sense at this moment to look to expand people's concept of what Zelda is and could be. If the scale of what we're discussing is smaller than 2028, would be more likely, but 2029 has a high chance of being the time period for a new Switch 2 mid-gen revision, and assuming a full new Zelda isn't available for the launch of the system, a fitness game of the type I laid out earlier in the video could be a good reason for people to find an advantage in having two Switch 2s in the same household, for an exercise-minded couple, for example. Once we get into the 2030s, it becomes even harder to predict the years with any specificity, but I would anticipate that the next game would either be a major mainline Zelda or a Hyrule Warriors takeoff of Ocarina of Time, although I think a Switch 2 version of A Link Between Worlds is low-hanging fruit, and while I can't see it making too much sense for the early days of the Switch 2, surely in the console's later years it will be a valuable way to keep the treadmill of Zelda games up, especially if there are delays with other titles. Who knows, A Link Between Worlds could be the next Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, the perennial favourite for the rumour mill. On the other hand, given that it could easily come to the original Nintendo Switch, we could see it dropped much sooner than we expect, perhaps as a game for the 40th anniversary that won't take the shine away from other Zelda content and other Switch 2 initiatives. If the Switch 2 Zelda was a little smaller in scale, perhaps a Dota-produced multiplayer title, then this would leave 2033 or 2034 to give us the new, breaking the conventions, epic next entry in the Zelda series. Now, all of this is what I feel is a logical roadmap for the Switch 2 era at least. However, as always with Zelda, there is a timeline split, and the dark timeline is what we should probably take as the baseline assumption. There is just one Zelda team, there is no significant branch team that's able to mount a new game, and they still take a very, very long time. In this instance, I would still expect a lot more Zelda franchise expansion activity in the early 2030s, but it seems significantly likely to me that the next Zelda could either skip Switch 2 or do a Twilight Princess, Breath of the Wild, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond deal and arrive as a crossover title. This is a difficult one for Nintendo though, as Zelda is the kind of game that could stand being exclusive to a new console. Wii and Switch were kind of unique in that they were broadly on the same power level, as they were on a more similar power level to their previous system compared with most generational leaps, but unless they do a mid-gen sidestep from the Switch 2, which I really don't anticipate, and I don't imagine Nintendo anticipate at this point, the next system will be a jump up in power akin to the Wii U and Switch 2, and so I don't really see a cross-gen Zelda being a logical step for them. It could be possible if they really hit the gas, I guess. Perhaps they release a game in 2028 and then the next one in 2033, but this would be fast even with an enlarging team. Why not just have Zelda as a late in life title for the systems though? Well, the problem is that Zelda is your classic system seller. If they pin it to mid-gen revisions, then maybe they could get away with a mid-life position for the franchise going forward, but in most systems, their top-selling games are the ones that release in the first few years, with the exception of series with multiple entries like Pokemon, or games that enter a system and become surprise hits like the Game Boy Pokemon. The big exception to this is clearly Super Mario Bros. Wonder, but even that game is clearly a less ambitious title graphically, designed as an anchor game for Switch owners who aren't yet progressing to Switch 2, and will almost certainly have a Switch 2 expansion anyway. Maybe Nintendo will lump having Zelda come late, but twice before they prefer just to spend time perfecting it to sync it with the console launch, and while it's much too far in the future to really make a call, I feel the possibility is likely unless they can manage to break down the teams in the manner I've suggested. Now, usually on this channel I try to give a little bit of accountability to videos like this by attaching percentage likelihoods to my forecasts. This means that I can, and every year or so do, check back to see whether my 90% forecasts have indeed come to pass 90% of the time, my 70% forecast 70% of the time, and so on. I'm trying increasingly to put these at the ends of videos for those who don't enjoy this sort of thing, which is, after all, just a bit of fun. The problem with this video, though, is that I'm dealing with such long-term considerations, and in the long term everything becomes far less likely as the world, let alone Nintendo, can change so much. Therefore, I will commit to just a few things now. 90% calls. I think there will be a new 2D Zelda from Grezo by 2030. 70% calls. There will be an Ocarina of Time remake by 2030. This may seem high, but the more time passes, the more certain I feel that this is the only next big game that makes sense for them. Also, 70% that next Grezo's title features Zelda as the lead, or at least one of the leads, and I also think that Daiki Iwamoto will have a significant role in developing a new Zelda game by the end of 2028, and I put that at 70% as well. Of course, the hardest thing about this one is proving it if he doesn't get invited to the Ask the Developer interviews, but the credits should show it. If he's an assistant producer again, I wouldn't count it, but as supervisor, or less likely, a director, well, that would be a different matter. I think there's a 30% chance we see Twilight Princess outside of Nintendo Classics in the next 3 years. It's possible, of course, but I just think Ocarina of Time is so much more promising for Nintendo, and I don't know there's much benefit in having Twilight Princess as well as the other titles, although, of course, they could bring Twilight Princess HD across. The time for Twilight Princess HD would logically have been the late Switch era, and I tend to think that goose is now cooked, but perhaps it could still have its time as we hit the 40th anniversary. I also give just 30% as a chance that we hear a formal announcement that the next Zelda game is in development by the end of 2026. Historically, Zelda titles have been announced quite early, but Nintendo has long since passed the point where they routinely do long-term announcements, and certainly they will want to keep the focus on Ocarina of Time if that game is as big a revamp of the originals as I would envisage. There might be some acknowledgement in interviews that, of course, they were always working on new Zelda, and I don't think this would count. We knew that they were working on the next Zelda right after Breath of the Wild in 2018, and Hidemaro Fujibayashi effectively already confirmed that a new Zelda was at least a twinkle in his eye while promoting Tears of the Kingdom. Maybe Doug Bowser gets cornered on the red carpet for the 2027 movie premiere and is forced to deny that the next game is off target, but something like the E3 2019 trailer, that I think is still likely a fair way off. Finally, and just for fun, I will say 30% there's a fitness-related Zelda title before 2029, but 70% there's a Zelda mode in an existing fitness title. Ring Fit already kind of had this, and if and when they do a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Ring Fit Adventure, that would surely count. I'd also say 30% there's some kind of Zelda game with a musical element by the end of the decade. That's pretty difficult to define, but Cadence of Hyrule would qualify, as well as a number of other games with musical components. Of course, I expect I will return to all these topics over the years ahead, and in this case I may have other forecasts or double down on ones already made, in which case those future forecasts will be assessed in addition to these ones, not instead of. Still, feel free to chuck your own theories into the comment section below if you think you have an insight into the Switch 2's Zelda future. If you like these kinds of videos, do check out my overview of the 2D Zelda team in recent years, and do subscribe to the channel, as I plan to make further videos deep diving the Switch 2 era prognosis for the other development teams in Nintendo's stables. Please also consider checking out the Patreon, which really does help me to carve out time to work on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.